Good morning from Notre Dame. Good afternoon in other parts of the world. Welcome to the 2021 Catholic Social Tradition Conference, Justice in the World, organized and brought to you by the Center for Social Concerns here at the University of Notre Dame. My name is Clemens Sedmak and I'll chair our first Friday panel. And what a lovely panel it is, judging from our esteemed panelists. This is one of 6 panels of this conference. The conference itself is a tradition started by our acting director, Bill Purcell. Every 2 years, we have a major event here on campus discussing a particular aspect of Catholic social tradition. Due to the pandemic, we decided to plan a virtual conference. Not very original, but necessary. This is also a bit of an experiment, and I ask for your patience and understanding if we encounter some glitches. The conference is celebrating the 50th anniversary of the beautiful document, Justice in the World, published by the World Synod of Catholic Bishops. The panel that is about to begin is entitled, Creating a Global Vision of Justice. We want to explore the major injustices that have to be addressed in our world. We want to identify wounds of the times on a global level and present justice as a remedy to these wounds. What does global justice look like? We have 1.5 hours to explore these issues together. And now I would like to introduce the 5 panelists who will guide us through these questions. My introduction will be very, very brief. I apologize. We have to be disciplined with the time since we have 5 wonderful panelists. Sister Helen Alford is a Dominican scholar and vice rector of the Angelicum in Rome. Father Stan Elo, a Catholic priest from Nigeria, is research professor of world Christianity and African studies at the Center for World Catholicism and Intercultural Theology at DePaul University in Chicago. Tabaldo Vinci Guerra sustains his family as an official from the Dicastery for Promoting Integral Human Development in Rome. Christina Astorga joins us as professor and chair of the theology department at the University of Portland. And Matthias Nebel serves as professor of Christian social ethics and as director of the Instituto Promotor del Bien Común at the UPAEP in Puebla, Mexico. They are all wonderful people, and we are so grateful that they will be with us for the next hour and a half. Sister Helen will talk about lessons we can learn from the document Justice in the World. Stan Elo will reflect on justice as Ubuntu. Tabaldo Vinci Guerra will talk about contributive justice in global terms. Christina Astorga will offer an input on climate change, climate justice, and migration. And Matthias Nebel will address the wounded sociality, do you say sociality in English, of our time. Each input will be about 8 to 10 minutes. I hope not more than 10 minutes. Afterwards, there will be the possibility to ask questions or to make comments. I can already invite you at this point and encourage you to do that, to use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen to ask questions or put comments. Welcome all. Thank you, dear audience, for joining us. Sister Helen, joining us from Rome. Thank you for being with us. The floor is yours. Now we can see you. I pause a little bit, but you are free to begin speaking. We are so excited to have you with us. Thank you, Sister Helen, and welcome.
Thank you so much, Clemens, and thank you to everyone who is here to celebrate this important document and to think about justice in the world today. So I wanted to talk under the title Justice in the World 2021, what still echoes from the Synod document of 1971. Because returning to a document after 50 years is quite an interesting thing to do. On the one hand, we can begin to gain some historical perspective on it. We're not so close to it and to the circumstances in which it was written, permitting us to see something in it that could not be seen at the time. Yet on the other hand, we're still relatively close to that time. Our experience of it is not yet completely cold. Many of us here today were alive at that time. I remember my sister made her first communion that year. So we are not so far away from it that the document can no longer speak to us in a living way. A 50-year commemoration has an interesting feel to it, quite different from a centenary, for instance. And this makes the choice of title for this panel by the Centre for Concern at Notre Dame and by all those involved in organising this important event, thanks to them all, it makes this title quite interesting, creating a global vision of justice. It allows us to touch those questions from the 1971 document that are still living for us today as part of creating a vision for the future. Insofar as the 1971 document was future-oriented, and I think it was, this meeting has something of the same feel and tone about it that surrounded the synod that produced it. And so maybe it is worth spending a few minutes on the synod itself. It was only the second meeting of the Synod of Bishops after its revival or renewal at Vatican II, and the first one that produced a final document that the Pope decided to publish. In fact, it produced two final documents, because the Synod had been tasked with dealing with two topics. And perhaps their combination might surprise us at first, for the full title of the Synod was Ministerial Priesthood and Justice in the World. And it produced two documents, each one under the two different parts of the Synod title. So it might be interesting to wonder how much the combination of these two topics influenced the way the final documents on the two topics were written. The one on the ministerial priesthood, split into two parts, contains references to the priest and temporal realities, that's in the first part on doctrinal principles, and to secular and political activities and economic questions and the priest in the second part, which is called Indications for Priestly Life and Ministry. It's quite interesting in that it's trying to delineate the role of the priest in relation to questions of justice and to lay people as much as anything else. Well, similarly, the document that is the object of our interest today is also quite intriguing in that it gives a lot of space to how the church needs to do an examination of conscience, as it calls it, regarding questions of justice. The longest part of the text, which has the subtitle, The Practice of Justice, slips often imperceptibly between that examination of conscience within the church and the consideration of injustice in wider society. It's often difficult to know who exactly is being addressed in the text. And in the end, you get the impression that injustice in the world and in the church are somehow interrelated and need to be addressed in an integral way. We find in the same document the famous statement we all know that action on behalf of justice and participation in the transformation of the world fully appear to us as a constitutive dimension of the preaching of the gospel in number 6, which is obviously a discourse about justice as a question of mission ad extra to the world as a whole. So we find that statement alongside another one at number 40, which says, while the church is bound to give witness to justice, she recognizes that anyone who ventures to speak to people about justice must first be just in their eyes. Hence, we must undertake an examination of the modes of acting and of the possessions and lifestyle found within the church herself. I think you can't help wondering if this is not, at least in part, the result of the extended reflection on the ministerial priesthood that happened alongside the reflection on justice in the world today within the same synodal meeting. In the document itself, furthermore, we see that the concept of justice, which is mentioned 62 times, is very connected with the word development, mentioned 35 times, and speaks about peoples, mentioned 63 times, and nations, mentioned 53 times. Now, when we see these references to development, to peoples, to nations, one immediately senses the presence of Populorum Progressio, which of course was only 4 years old at the time, and this new line of thinking that it began, and which would become over time a kind of second seminal document, along with Rerum Novarum, in the development of the church's social teaching. So for the rest of my time, I would like to look again at the last 8 propositions of the document, since the Synod Fathers, and I'd add 2 women who were also part of the Synod, prefaced these comments with the words, "We urge Catholics to consider well the following propositions." So allowing their voice to echo across the last 50 years, let us consider well these propositions in our day. Because what is so striking about them is their continual reference to multilateral institutions and multilateral action as the way of confronting the injustices of the world in 1971. The first proposition begins with the words, "Let recognition be given to the fact that the international order is rooted in the inalienable rights and dignity of the human being," and calls on all governments to ratify the UN Declaration of Human Rights. The second proposition calls for support of the UN and of international organizations in general, insofar, as it says, as they are the beginning of a system capable of restraining the armaments race, discouraging trade in weapons, securing disarmament, and settling conflicts by peaceful methods of legal action, arbitration, and international police action. The third proposition calls for the aims of the second development decade to be fostered and goes into that in quite some detail. Another proposition talks about UN specialized agencies, which it says, although they can be improved, are to be supported. And in that section has quite an interesting discussion about the population explosion, which people thought was on the horizon then, and mentions Populorum Progressio in doing so. But I think the proposition that merits being quoted in full here is number 7. And it goes like this. "We consider that we must also stress the new worldwide preoccupation, which will be dealt with for the first time in the Conference on the Human Environment to be held in Stockholm in June 1972. It is impossible to see what right the richer nations have to keep up their claim to increase their own material demands, if the consequence is either that others remain in misery or that the danger of destroying the very physical foundations of life on earth is precipitated. Those who are already rich are bound to accept a less material way of life with less waste, in order to avoid the destruction of the heritage which they are obliged by absolute justice to share with all other members of the human race." I think in our 2021 world, after Laudato Si, in the face of the climate crisis that we know we must confront, in the year of the COP26 in Glasgow, and when we are still reeling under the effects of the pandemic, this ringing endorsement of multilateral agencies and multilateral action, and the emphasis on our need to confront justice in relation to the environment, rings truer than ever. Indeed, it could have been written yesterday. So in conclusion, I think we can see in this text a great deal of fertile thinking that can help us to create a global vision of justice, as this panel wants to do, for 2021 and beyond. And I look forward to hearing others who will be speaking and asking questions after me, who will put some flesh on that vision. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Sister Helen. Thank you so much for reminding us of the prophetic nature of this unfortunately almost timeless document, reminding us of multilateral institutions and the plight of the environment. And dear friends in the audience, Sister Helen is a role model in so many ways, including timekeeping. Thank you so much for that. We can move on now from Sister Helen, who discussed the document itself, to Father Stan Ilo, who will discuss a particular approach to justice from, if I may say so, African perspective. Father Stan, it's great to have you with us. Please, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you very much, Clemens, and thank you for the invitation. I'm going to speak about a vision of global justice from the perspective of the African Ubuntu. One of the most poignant scenes during the hearing of the post-apartheid South African Truth and Reconciliation Commission was the occasion when Archbishop Desmond Tutu, who was chairing the commission, collapsed. Archbishop Tutu collapsed upon hearing the shocking confession of a white police officer who had killed a black man, Simpiwe, with rat poison prior to burning his body on a bonfire while he and his colleagues roasted their lunch by the side simultaneously. Archbishop Tutu, reflecting on this incident, speaks of the loss of humanity, the loss of humaneness, the loss of compassion, and the loss of God that took hold of many people during the apartheid regime to commit these kinds of atrocities and descend so low in the disregard for human life that one could kill a fellow human being because he was Black and burn his body while roasting his lunch by the side at the same time. Simpiwe, just like George Floyd, could have been me. I am really convinced that there can be no global justice unless we deal with racism against people of African descent, because many people who look like me do not feel that they belong in this world. Mother Teresa used to say that humans have found the cure for literally every disease in the world, but we have failed to find the cure to the greatest ailment facing the world, which is the sad reality that there are millions of people in the world who are unloved and unaccepted and who are dying of poverty because no one cares about them. Many people are dying today because of their place of birth, their sex, their nationality, their gender, their sexuality. And this is so glaringly apparent during this pandemic, which justifies what Martin Luther King Jr. said many years ago, that of all the forms of inequality, injustice in healthcare is the most shocking and inhumane. There can be no global vision of justice if we do not have the right gaze to see, judge, and denounce evils in our world, and to recognize how present suffering, the semi-permanent humanitarian and immigration crisis in the world, wars, terrorism, climate change, and poverty in the world are the cumulative result of many acts of injustice and structural violence that have been perpetrated through slavery, colonialism, imperialism, neoliberal capitalism, and many global economic, social, and political policies and practices designed by many Western nations over the past centuries, of which sometimes churches have been active enablers. My proposal is that the African notion of communitarian justice, Ubuntu, is capable of rehumanizing both perpetrators and victims of injustice and evil in the world. Ubuntu, I must say, is an ideal. It may never have been perfectly realized in the past or even today, but I argue that societies outside the West are providing social laboratories for finding alternative forms of justice and proving the viability and practical utility of traditional African epistemologies for modern conceptions of political ideas, justice, and governance. Ubuntu was an imperfect attempt by South Africans to wipe away the tears of those who had been bruised and battered by injustice and evil in the white supremacist apartheid regime and the subsequent attempt to heal South Africa. Ubuntu can also be a good model for the rest of the world. Why? Because Ubuntu is the ethics of community that affirms that a person is only a person through other persons, that we are all related, we all belong, and that I can only be truly who I am meant to be by God if I am affirmed, supported, and accepted within a community of love and equality. Archbishop Tutu gives a good description of the contribution of Ubuntu to a new understanding of justice when he writes, and I quote, "Here, the central concern is not retribution or punishment. In the spirit of Ubuntu, the central concern is the healing of breaches, the redressing of imbalances, the restoration of broken relationships, a seeking to rehabilitate both the victims and the perpetrator, who should be given the opportunity to be reintegrated into the society that he has injured by his offense, unquote. Thus, Ubuntu invites us to go beyond punitive or retributive actions that alienate offenders through incarceration and even death penalty, to communal acts and rituals of healing, confession, restoration, and reintegration of both victims and perpetrators. The key process in Ubuntu is dialogue and storytelling as a journey toward what many have called negotiated justice rather than adjudicated justice. Ubuntu is a victim-centered justice approach because it insists on accountability for all acts of injustice committed against the victims as presented through the lens of the painful narratives of the victims. There is an insistence on truthful, complete, and transparent confession of sin, atonement by the perpetrators of evil, before then the painful and slow journey of restoration, restitution, reparation, forgiveness, and healing of the social ecology can proceed. Ubuntu as a victim-centered justice system also affirms that the victim is not simply the individual who has been wounded, but also the entire society, including the perpetrators of injustice and oppression, the earth, God, and the entire cosmos. When anyone is victimized or oppressed, everyone in society is wounded as well. The empowerment and the vindication of the victim is very central in this justice process. By locating the victim within the wider historical, social connections and bonds of life, the community embraces a grace moment to identify with the victims of history by owning up that the suffering and pain of the victims today diminishes everyone in that community, and their continued suffering of the consequences of past injustice, if not addressed, sickens and weakens the community. Conclusion. A global vision of justice must pay greater attention to the cries of the poor in the world and victims of injustice and victims of history. Everywhere and every day, we see how the voices of the poor and the marginalized and those carrying painful wounds of historical injustice in this nation, America, and in the world at large are often suppressed. In many instances, they suffer double victimhood because the process of addressing the inequities in the world are designed and moderated by the same perpetrators of injustice and those who hold the levers of power and those who benefit from the unjust global political and economic systems and institutions wreaking havoc in the world among peoples and cultures. Unless those who are suffering today and those who bear the wounds of injustice in particular settings, including in our churches, unless they assume the podium to mouth with their own voices their pains and become architects in shaping their own future and our common destiny, local or global efforts for a just world will continue to end up in good conference papers like this one, statements at the UN, statements by the Pope and churches, and documents from the synod or synods and conventions. I'd like to conclude with a story because I started with a story, and storytelling is something that we cherish in our African tradition. When I was asked to participate in the International Global Panel of a Global Vision of Justice, my mind went back to the middle-aged African-American man, Anthony, that I met at the Chicago River Bridge while I was taking my friend from Nigeria on a tour of Chicago in 2016. I asked Anthony to take our picture. He told me that he does not know how to use a cell phone. I wondered, how can an American not know how to use a cell phone? I asked him why, And he said he had just been released from prison and that the knapsack he had was the only property he owned, and that he was incarcerated before cell phones became popular. I was stunned, and I wondered what justice and hope looks like for this man. When I asked him where he was heading to, he had no answer because he said, I have no dream. I have no hope. I have no family. I have no friends. I just wish to get to Union Station so that I can figure things out. As we enter the Holy Week, I think of how Jesus unites our human history and the story of God's vision and dream for a world that is healed and restored on the cross. Jesus embodies the spirit of Ubuntu in its paradigmatic form. He was a man for others. In the same way, a global vision of justice must be such that it helps individuals like Anthony, who are wandering the path of life without hope or dreams, because they are held in the chokehold of history, so that they can find a place to lament and tell their stories, but also so that they can find a community they can call home. In this world that God has gifted us as guardians of creation and guardians of one another, we must work by night and day and make the needed sacrifice to incarnate love, justice, truth, mercy, peace, and hope as the only praxis for reweaving the broken networks of human and cosmic life. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Father Stan. Thank you so much for also offering a bridge from yesterday evening's opening panel on racism and racial justice, where the message no global justice without overcoming racism was also very prominent and explicitly articulated. I'm very grateful and touched by your stories. Touched by your sentence, when anyone is suppressed, everyone is wounded in society. And we will take it to heart. What does it mean to listen to the cries of the poor and allow their voices to articulate their pain? Thank you, Father Stan. We move to Tabaldo Vinci Guerra, who will help us understand a particular aspect of global justice in terms of contributive justice. And Tabaldo will share some slides. And I'm very grateful that you are with us, Tabaldo. Greetings to Rome, and the floor is yours. Thank you.
It is a pleasure. Thank you very much, Clemens. Thank you very much to Notre Dame University for this invitation. Greetings of peace to all of you from the Dicastery for Promoting Integral Human Development. When I received this invitation, I immediately had in mind two ideas. The first one was, wow, what a title, Justice on Global Level. So a mix of vertical subsidiarity from international to local level. The other idea was a global vision of justice, an integral one. So commutative justice, procedural justice, and so on. But for this, please just refer to the compendium of the social teaching of the Church. We have various levels of justice, and as Clement said, I have a family, so I try to make things simple, and hopefully now you can see a very naive sketch in the top right of my slide. We are in Lent, and we are invited to almsgivings. So it is also a way of restoring justice to the poor, giving back, even for a brief moment, a little bit of what he was entrusted to have, of what he should or she should have had. But there is a second level, obviously. It is the fight for ensuring equal opportunities. What about school, friendships, healthcare, access to justice? This also is a fight, this also is a form of justice. And we have a third level, which is fighting the problems which are prohibiting this kind of equal opportunities to all. So corruption, unfair trade. So this resonates with the analysis of Sister Helen, but also ideologies which humiliate human dignity, the other race, the other people, the stranger. So various level of justice. Almost always the same project, the same initiative won't be able to address those three levels. They are different. Yet you can always do something according to our wealth, influence, status, knowledge, awareness. Just do it. Whatever can be done, just do it. Bring your contribution. And whenever we mention contribution, there is a bell that rings. It is contributive justice. And we have in mind taxation. Contributive justice as a form of progressive taxation. So it is not a flat tax, the same percent for everybody, yet a progressive taxation for the common good, which is wise, which is supported by the pontifical magisterium. Yet, I would like to underscore 4 points. First one, be careful of meritocracy language, as it may be used to justify and perpetrating inequalities while forgetting the question of the initial endowment. Now, I quote John Rawls. So, you were an educated man? Yes, but who paid for your education? You were a good man, but who taught you your good manners? Who raised you in a good family? Who showed you care and affection? Must you not admit that what you have received? Secondly, taxation is ineffective and hard to accept in settings corrupted with a weak and ineffective administration. So we really need to have smart administration and also judges or courts, tribunals able to work according to integral ecology, to transboundary challenges, to locate the issue in the broad context of integral ecology, Laudato Si, chapter 4. So judges are no longer here about he has stolen 2 of my cows instead of the 1 cow I had agreed to give him. Now it's about communities, societies, human rights, biodiversity, lack of transparency, due diligence, bribery, pollution, complexity, and interconnectedness. And fourth point, we should refrain from paternalistic approach. That means just delegate everything to the government. I paid my taxes, it is enough. I've done what the law was requiring from me, it is enough. This is a problem which is often faced by my office when we dialogue with mining companies. Well, we went overseas and we followed the regulations. Well, maybe this is not enough. Maybe sometime the justum is not enough and we should move towards the bonum. Can we then design or economics or businesses or agreements according to this bonum, so going beyond according to the logic of gift? Yes, the logic of gift. This is my conclusion. What if the logic of gift beyond and before the logic of reciprocity is the proper way for healing relations, for establishing justice? We were loved first by God. We were loved first. So according to the analysis by Professor Luigino Bruni, he's very much involved in the economy of communion. If you want to save a wood, if you want to trace a map, to create an NGO, then you need a group of citizens, even small, but to be the starters, to engage without warranties of reciprocity or success. They think better me than no one. Then they take donation. They act donating. It is risky. They may be subject of ridicule and considered naive and perhaps exploited by the opportunists. But we need this gift logic to take care of our commons in the light of the common good of the whole human family. When I decide to give up what is mine in order to realize something that is ours, then I start doing something. Maybe a few ones will follow, not all, but a few ones, and we will have then reciprocity. Otherwise, commons will perish. A few examples. The first one is the parable of the Samaritan, which is at the heart of Fratelli Tutti. Please remember, a Samaritan, while traveling, came near the wounded, robbed man. When he saw him, he was moved with pity. He went to him, bandaged his wounds, then he put him on his own animal, brought him to an inn, and took care of him. The next day he took out 2 denarii, gave them to the innkeeper, and said, "Take care of him." End quote. Well, it starts with gratuity, with generosity, but later also with reciprocity. There is the trade, there is commutative justice with the 2 denarii. The dicastery is working a lot on WASH, on access to water, especially in this specific week. Wastewater is often disposed without any treatment. Sadly, it is a scandal. But it can be treated, yes, but it can also be wisely used to safely regenerate soil in arid areas. A gift approach, giving something else. Some ways of operating farms can also provide benefits to the environment, while at the same time, obviously, helping to produce food and other agricultural goods. Some buildings can contribute also to cleaning the air, to purifying the air even of those people who do not live or have not paid for that building. But again, the entrepreneur, the owners, has to start this idea of gift. Because if we give, then we are certainly establishing some kind of just relations with the environment, with nature, which sustains us. And it will have positive impacts for all society. Then this is the question: how can we embed, how can we devise the logic of gift? Please do not hesitate to read in Fratelli Tutti the only quote, the only paragraph where water is mentioned. Thank you very much. I look forward for our discussion.
Thank you so much, Tabaldo. Thank you so much for reminding us of the logic of gift, or inviting us to rethink so many of our established categories in the light of this challenge, the logic of gift. I'm also grateful for your suspicion of the idea of meritocracy. There are so many ways to justify one's seemingly justified position. And we are grateful for being reminded of Fratelli Tutti, of course. We will now move on to Professor Christina Astorga, whom I first met in her native country, the Philippines, where she was already chairing a theology department. Tina, thank you so much for being with us. Professor Astorga will continue to talk about issues related to climate challenges. And if I may call on you, Tina, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Clemens. People migrate for many reasons. Migration is a complex phase. This paper addresses particularly migration and its link with climate change. The migration of people in the form of displacement or forced relocation within and beyond their national borders is largely driven by climate change. Environmental migration is not a new phenomenon, for changes in environmental conditions have been migration drivers throughout history. What is new are the anthropogenic drivers of climate change, as it has been shown that global displacement of peoples is caused by pernicious consequences of global warming brought about the world's polluting nations. Climate-induced migration cannot be addressed without considering climate justice. An exclusive focus on climate-induced migration can easily mask the issues of injustice that have caused the forced migration or relocation of people. It can also overlook the responsibility of the people causing it. Climate change justice concept brings to question the equity question and human rights issues. The nexus between climate change and migration is highly politicized and problematic. But unless climate justice is addressed, the global problem of climate change cannot be addressed as its source. Only its effects would be mitigated as far as human effort can possibly do, but the root of the problem would not be dealt with. It is widely recognized that those most at risk in the midst of climate change are not those who belong to countries and cultures which are economically privileged, rather the poor and marginalized who are the least responsible for its effects and consequences, and whose lot depends on how those who are responsible would come to the repentance and fulfill their ethical responsibilities. The impact of climate change is anticipated to displace up to 250 million people worldwide by 2050. An annual average of 21.5 million people have been forcibly displaced by weather-related sudden onset hazards such as floods, storms, wildfires, extreme temperature since year 6, 2008. The poorest and the most marginalized, those who have contributed to the least to global warming, suffer disproportionately its ravages compared to the consumerists and polluters from rich and affluent nations. Climate change is a global phenomenon. The global economy that is fueled by dirty energy and a global way of life that is fundamentally consumerist have created a world that is now battling the effects of climate change, ever so in danger of driving itself to ruin. While climate change is global, it is no one person's responsibility and is no one person's fault, but is a collective responsibility. Still, there are those who bear more responsibility than others. Climate justice pertains to the unjust distribution of climate change effects, such that those who contribute the least to cause it suffer most its effects and consequences. Climate change degrades, dehumanizes, damages, and kills people by limiting or preventing their access to the necessities for life or for its flourishing. The insidious characteristics of climate injustice is its tendency to remain invisible to those not suffering from it. Invisible to the effects of climate change, wealthy people in industrialized world can still deny the problem and consequently ignore the violence of climate change. Julia Hagstrom argues that climate justice must be taken as a basis for international policies on migration, as this allows responsibility to be put on those who caused the problem. Heads of the states of Bolivia, Cuba, Dominican, Honduras, and Venezuela in 2009 asserted that capitalism is leading humanity and planet to extinction, with climate change as a key example. They emphasized the disproportionate distribution of climate change effects, with those who have done the least to cause them, suffering the full brunt of them. Developed countries should pay off their debt to humankind and the planet. They should provide the significant resources to a fund so that developing countries can embark upon a growth model which does not repeat serious impacts of the capitalist industrialization. Climate debt, as it is called, is prominent in Latin America and Africa, but it has yet to be validated by leaders in the developed nations of Europe or North America. Applying the principle of intersectionality to climate justice, the many common threads that link environmental abuses to patterns of discrimination by race, gender, sexual orientation, and other social factors are brought to light. Climate change exacerbates poverty and gender inequality. The poor are the most vulnerable to climate change. Women, who make up 70% of the world's poor, are doubly marginalized that they are poor and that they are women. Research has shown that women are particularly more vulnerable to climate change than men. As caregivers and nurturers of communities predominantly responsible for food production, as well as for household water supply and energy for heating and cooking, women bear the full brunt of the climate change impact. The climate justice approach reveals how people are affected by climate change not only disproportionately, but also differently. When applied, it should observe the principle of equity, as voluntary migration is different from forced migration and from climate exile. Voluntary migrants are usually those who choose to leave their country, and often there are those with resources. Multiple drivers, one of which could be related to climate change, are linked to their choice to leave. Climate migrants are differentiated from climate exiles, as they are those who are displaced by the drivers of climate change, who are mostly internally displaced people, but can have the opportunity to return to their countries or regions, while climate exiles are forced out of their countries and have become permanently stateless. Migration is not as simple as packing your home on your back, but it involves a number of issues that must be addressed, such as the preservation of the identity and cultures of a community. Also, the countries that receive these displaced persons will need appropriate preparation, education, and consciousness raising. Climate-induced migration is a long-term commitment involving all concerned parties. What climate justice requires is climate-induced migration with dignity. This will depend on the hospitality of the host nations, which welcome, facilitate, support the resettlement of these migrants. What do prosperous nations do to meet the humanitarian crisis in poorer nations like my country? In the aftermath of Haiyan, the United States granted temporary protected status to Philippine nationals. The designation is known formally as TPS, which is typically granted to immigrants for countries affected by natural disasters or war, allowing them to live and work legally in the US for a specific period of time. During Typhoon Ketsana in 2009, Canada introduced immigration relief measures as part of their humanitarian assistance to the Philippines. It gave priority to the processing of existing and new applications of family class applicants under the Immigration and Refuge Protection Act. Canada has also implemented the same response at the aftermath of Typhoon Haiyan. While humanitarian migration is laudable, it can easily mask the issues of injustice surrounding climate change causes, effects, and consequences. Only when climate-induced migration is addressed on the basis of climate justice that the social roots of the issue, the reckoning of responsibility, and necessary agency for change are dealt with. Furthermore, only on this basis that a migration with dignity policy can be envisioned and enforced. Humanitarian acts can give a false notion that one has already done one's part without dealing with the root cause of why such humanitarian acts should be done in the first place and how one's actions have led to the problem that one is trying to address. They deal with the consequences rather than with the causes. It is about time that polluting, prosperous nations should repent of climate change, make reparations of the havoc that their actions have wreaked the world, and pay their climate debt to humankind as the imperative of climate justice demands. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Christina. Thank you so much. Reminding us of, that's a powerful sentence, development countries should pay back their debt to humankind. Reminding us of the intersectionality of climate justice, migration, the gender dimension, and also reminding us of humanitarian acts that can give us this false sense of self-righteousness, which we have heard before in Stan's and Tabaldo's presentations. Thank you so much. We move now to Puebla, Mexico, where Professor Nebel will help us understand the social dimensions and its challenges from a justice perspective. Matthias, thank you so much for being with us. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Clemens. Thank you very much for the invitation. I will speak about the wounded sociality, its English sociality of our time. Well, 10 minutes away from my home in Puebla, a whole city has emerged in the last 15 years. A city for the rich and powerful, a so-called gated community of about 60,000 inhabitants. High walls topped with barbed or electric wire keep apart this area and population from the outside, namely the rest of the Mexican society, the middle class and the poor. It is indeed a city built against other in distrust, not only of the people left outside, but also, and most interestingly, in polite distrust of the very neighbors of the gated community. The aporophobia that leaves the poor outside combines here with a neurotic need to keep others out of my life. As in Dante's Inferno, you enter by a few doors heavily manned by private police that check every single car entering the place. But beyond the doors, there is no city, no community. You enter a labyrinth of further and ever smaller gated communities, each with high walls, barbed wires, and private police. Even the houses are built in such a way that neighbors can't access my property or even peek into my garden. This is not a place to live together. It is a place like hell, where people fear the others and do not want to engage with them. A place where others have no face, no voice, and no meaning for me. How did we get there? What has happened to our societies that we now build new prison-like cities to defend ourselves from others? How come that a whole generation of Mexicans now aspire to live in such golden prison-like environment? But then, is this just an awkward example of modern urbanism, an isolated case without further meaning? Pope Francis does not think so. This gated city in Puebla can be seen as a metaphor for the wounded sociality of our time. In Fratelli Tutti, the Pope describes indeed something very similar. The complex construction process of a globalized world is not living up to its promises because some of its main tenets and drivers are flown, says Francis. Globalization, says the Pope, has brought a systemic exclusion of the people that have no place and no value in it. The very functioning of the global economy drives a throwaway culture for a small elite, gloriously indifferent to the fate of the people left behind. Moreover, globalization also brought a systemic imbalance in our relationship with the environment. The way we produce and consume is predatory, not sustainable, and is leading to the destruction of the earth as our shared and common home. Societies in this globalized world are gripped by selfishness and indifference and fear. Pope Francis even speaks of a globalization of selfishness and indifference. Yet, he does not frame his answer for the wounded sociality of our world only around the notion of justice, but also and mainly from the perspective of fraternity. He sees the present situation has a lack of love, which induces in turn a lack of justice. In Fratelli Tutti, he chooses the passage of the Good Samaritan to express the bond of humanity on which we should build our society. It certainly recognizes the call to justice, but goes beyond it too. The Good Samaritan displays toward the other, the wounded, discarded stranger on the side of the road, a solicitude that answers and reveals a call to love each other as brothers and sisters, a call, in other terms, to universal fraternity. Pope Francis shows then in the rest of the encyclical how the dynamic of globalization fails this fraternity, wounding the very humanity of our coexistence. Like the gated community in Puebla, the world is heading, if nothing changes, in the Pope vision, toward a society where the others has no face, no voice, and no meaning to me. I can't devote here the time that would be needed to carefully review this claim made by Pope Francis, and we should actually. Let me just focus instead on one point. The long-standing tenet of Jewish and Christian theology that justice alone, while of utmost importance, is not sufficient. It must be fought in relationship to love. And this may probably prove to be one of the most challenging issues of the notion of justice today. To drive this point home, I will shortly dialogue with three authors, if times allow it, namely Michael Sandels, Teresa Phelps, and Paul Ricoeur. In his latest book, The Tyranny of Merit, Sandels calls into question our present obsession with distributive justice. His work analyzes the way we have socially constructed and rewarded individual merits as a combination of talent, hard work, while trying to compensate for the growing inequalities created by this meritocracy by a feverish insistence on the need for an equality of opportunity. Sandels shows this to be an illusion. Not only do embedded privileges and chance alter academic success, the supposed equalizer machine of meritocracy, but this meritocracy is also shadowing and secretly despising the people who, for the lack of talent and hard work, are not selected by the sorting machine itself. Sandels rightly argues that something important is going amiss in the notion of justice shaping liberal democracies, namely the common good. That is, the public and political discussion about the meaning and social value of some goods like work, education, the environment. The very discussion, in other words, on ends and values other than justice that Rawls so categorically discarded from his theory of justice. What makes the humanity of our living together? What social value should we recognize to work, education, or the environment? How do basic common goods build up as a system of common good? For Sandel, these questions are key to address and eventually amend the growing inequalities and humiliations that feeds the popular resentment against the privileged elite and on which messianic leader thrives. In other words, justice alone does not do the trick. Teresa Goldwyn Phelps, in Shattered Voices, explores another limit of justice. By studying survivors of torture, she shows that the victim do not only, or even mainly, seek a just retribution for their tormentors' action against them. What they did to them goes beyond repair and retribution. They rather seek to recover something they have lost in the torment and abuses they suffered at the hand of their torturers, their sense of self-respect, their dignity, and a future. That is, a possibility to project themselves as having a future life worth living. More than just retribution, which is impossible in these cases. Victim of torture, once they forego the impulse for revenge and want to make their torture pay and suffer for their past abuse, realize that this will not bring them back what they have lost. Retribution alone encloses them in the past circle of violence. Retribution alone does not open a future for the victim. to have again a life of their own, not inhabited by the constant shadow of their torturer, victim must forgive in order to get free of them. Justice without forgiveness binds the victim to their tormentors. Justice alone is not enough. The same idea is developed by Paul Ricoeur in Amour and Justice. Justice must open to a wider horizon than mere equality if it does not want to close itself and be perverted. Ricoeur, building on Aristotle's ethic, sees a dialectic relationship between justice and love, where the search for equality ultimately serves another purpose, namely our common and continued friendship. And what is true of friends and close relationship also stays true of long, mediated, that is, institutional relationships, says Ricoeur. Equality for itself is not enough for society as long as it does not serve another purpose, our common and enduring fraternity. Fraternity is to justice the démesure in French, the lack of measure, the lack of calculus, the generosity and gift that opens it constantly in favor of the other. Fraternity discloses the claim of equality and allows for something different to happen than mere justice, namely a shared history, a shared dignity, a shared humanity. A society that does not disclose the claim of equality and open it to the normative horizon of fraternity will fall into a trap where myself slowly drives away from the other, failing into indifference. To conclude, the role given to justice as the exclusive pillar on which to build a modern, secular, and plural society appears more and more as an ideological construct, whatever roles may say. This insistence was perhaps needed to impose and protect individual rights and freedom against the social control of strong communal life in the 18th and 19th century. It seems to me that the question has slowly shifted during the 20th century and is now firmly different. How do we build communal life? What does it mean to live together as human beings? How do we build a human world? If we have to move away from prison-like gated communities, if you have to build a world based on fraternity, I have the impression that we should, 1, disclose the notion of justice, 2, reconsider the dialectic relationship existing between justice and love, and 3, rethink the social contract we claim to exist at the root of our societies. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Matthias. Thank you so much. Deep and thought-provoking as always. And when I talked about sociality, I meant my problem in pronouncing the term. I never questioned your English-speaking capacities. Friends, these are our 5 contributions by our panelists. We have a little less than half an hour for questions or comments or footnotes. I've received one question, which is about the availability of the scripts of the talks. And my response to that would be, I will consult with my colleagues here at the Center for Social Concerns. Please look at the website. And if we have material that we can put up on the website, we will do so. What I've heard so far is, and please, dear audience, use the time to put some questions in the Q&A button. What I've heard so far is that justice is 2-dimensional. We have the dimension ad extra and the dimension ad intra from the church's perspective. And Sister Helen made it very clear. We have the institutional dimension and the individual dimension. Again, Sister Helen and also Tabaldo, Vinci, Guerra made it clear the role of multilateral institutions on the one hand, but also the role of individuals and their contributions. Then we have the 2 dimensions of the global level of analysis and the micro level of encounter and storytelling. Father Stan was very powerful in reminding us of that. And then listening to you, I thought of some indicators of justice. Where should we look for if we try to understand the justice levels in our society and beyond? That's the healthcare system, that's the tax system, that's the water supply management system, that's migration, and that's the question of how we build communities, with Matthias's example of the gated community. And then thirdly and finally, I heard many reminders about we have to go beyond justice. There's a connection between justice and hope. Just think of Father Stan's story of the homeless man he met in Chicago, who told him, well, he has no hope, he has no family, he has nowhere to go, he has no plans. There is the connection between justice and gift in Tabaldo Vinci Guerra's contribution. There is the connection between justice and duty to go beyond humanitarian acts. There is the connection between justice and trust. And then in some talks mentioned the connection between justice and meritocracy, go beyond this illusion that you deserve what you have. And I leave us with this sentence from Matthias's presentation: justice alone does not do the trick. Justice alone does not do the trick. Which brings me maybe to a question to the panel. And the question is this: if we accept the idea that justice will not do the trick, do we see that in one of two ways? Way number one, we first need to achieve justice, and then we can think about what's missing and it's yet incomplete. Or do we consider justice as being misleading, because we should not concentrate our energies on justice, which in the end will not bring the desired result? And in the light of yesterday's panel on racial justice, I think this question is kind of relevant. And maybe may I start with Father Stan. How do you see the connection between justice, especially also racial justice, and this question of, well, justice alone will not do the trick? Father Stan, if I may put you on the spot, please.
Thank you, Clemens. How I wish I have the answers. Then all the problems of the world would have been solved. I think that it's about the rationalistic approach to justice and the legalistic approach to justice. Justice, in my own framework, is a process. It is an ideal, but it's something, as a Filipino theologian, the name does not come here, says bits and pieces. Sometimes this globalization of justice seems to be too noisy, because I think that what I understand, Matthias, and I'm happy he referred to Paul Ricoeur, is actually about weaving daily processes and action. Justice is intersubjective, interpersonal, local processes. So specifically within the church, I mean, it's easy for us to talk about global justice, but I think that the church can model it, like Sister Helen rightly noted for us. So that's where I think we should begin, is the local processes, local parishes, trying to heal wounded relationship in our institutions, in our workplaces. So people have stories of how justice looks like that they can then begin to apply in multiple contexts outside their locality.
Thank you, Father Stan. Sister Helen, may I in all friendship put you on the spot and ask you, having listened to the 4 contributions after you, is there any way you would reread the document that you talked about, Justice in the World? Or do you feel confirmed in this is a prophetic document that said something which is really valid and important today?
Thank you, Clemens. I'm learning how to put people on the spot. That's great. So I think I would say that it's for sure this is a document of its time. It's emerging out of the council experience. It's dealing with the beginnings of the conferences on the environment. At that time, people thought there was going to be a population explosion. Now we're all worried about aging across the world. So there's things that are going to be obviously quite specific to that period. But I think, you know, I said I was hoping that people would put flesh on this, creating the global vision. And I think that's what we've seen, because we've seen in Father Stan this very powerful, very articulate and, you know, really, really useful reflection on this idea of Ubuntu and how it can reinforce the way we think about justice and give it this other dimension that you were talking about just in your last question. We're thinking about migrants and the way the climate issue is pushing migration. And you know, on the one hand, we want to say people have a right to migrate, but I think you ask most migrants, they tell you they didn't want to leave their country. You know, it's not their free choice. And then we've got Matthias's wonderful presentation starting from those gated communities, and it made me think about medieval cities as well. In that sense, we recognize that the common good is more extensive today, that we find this idea of the gated city kind of strange today, because we have this possibility of a more big common good. So, and of course the water issue that Tabaldo was talking about. So I think, I think that there's a bigness in that vision from the Synod, which can incorporate these, but we need to put the flesh on of our day onto that vision. But I think the vision is still pretty relevant. As I tried to say, it's only 50 years ago. It's 50 years ago, but it's only 50 years ago in a way. And it's still quite close to us and tells us a lot still.
Thank you, Sister Helen. I will turn 50 later this year, so I'm pleased to hear it's only 50 years ago. May I ask a question for Tina Astorga, please? And the question that was brought to me in the chat is, what institutions besides the church do you think can play the most important role in promoting global justice, especially in the climate justice and migration issue? Which institutions besides the church, Tina? You are muted. Tina, you are muted. Give yourself a voice. Yes, please.
I believe the government is very critical, right, in promoting justice, because like, for instance, I am just so amazed at what Biden is doing now, right? He's pushing justice, and he's shifting the balance from the rich to the poor, and those who are the least, the least and the marginalized in society, with his 1.5, I think 19.5 stimulus. So he's shifting the balance from the tax-free cuts for the rich, and help for the poor. So politics and government are critical in pushing the justice. I just want to say something about love and justice, and I think we can learn from other traditions, like, for instance, the Buddhist tradition. And the Buddhist tradition is talking about interdependence, that our lives are so interdependent that we cannot speak of the human apart from the non-human, the earth, and the cosmos. And it's so interdependent that we are the condition of each other's emergence. And there was one quote that struck me when I was reading Buddhist tradition, and it says that solidarity should be a natural impulse, not a moral imperative. That was quite something, right? That that solidarity is a way of being beyond even a way of choosing, because it's the very nature of things. It's the very nature of who we are. We are just so deeply connected with each other.
Thank you, Tina. And obviously, if it's natural, it's not meritorious if we act in solidarity. It's basically who we are.
Yeah.
May I take a question from the Q&A for Matthias? It starts with greetings from the Philippines. So greetings from the Philippines. Indigenous peoples are at multiple crossroads of justice issues. They are often economically disadvantaged, ecologically vulnerable, and racially discriminated. How can we help them without being paternalistic? And I know that Matthias has a lot of experience in thinking about this question and doing something about it. Please, Professor Nebel.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the question. It's a tricky question. I think that the question is practical. Where do we begin? And whereas in my presentation I've insisted on the dialectic relationship between justice and love, this does not mean that responding perhaps to the first question of Clemens, that we should discard justice and begin with love and then see if there is a remaining question of justice somewhere. No, I think that the road toward love is justice. And so the first imperative we have to answer is frequently, as in this practical case, is to address question of justice. The thing is that justice is certainly a theoretical concept, but it is a very practical and communal concept too, you know? So that the first element is to see with the community what are the issues of justice actually here and now. What do we want to do together against the oppression, the unjust structures that are keeping us poor, dependent, and this is precisely the way to avoid a paternalistic approach, you know, empowering the community to answer itself the call to justice, meaning by it, not that the state does not have to do anything, no, but that the state must be in a role of accompaniment, because too frequently the state comes with its institution, personnel, and actually tells the community what the issues of justice at stake are in this situation. But the people on the ground know better, know far better than the government usually what the stake of justice are here and now. So I think this is the way, empowering communities so that they can see what justice asks from us here and now.
Thank you, Matthias. And then people should know that Matthias Nervel is the director of an institute that is actively involved in community building and supporting the common good. I have to look at distributive justice here with our panelists, as you can imagine. So before I ask two questions to Father Stan, let me ask a question to Tabaldo, Vinci, Guerra. And the question is here from the Q&A, given the rise of political nationalism, even the restrictions of COVID vaccines, what practical advice would you give to realize the vision of justice in the world? What can we as individuals do? Please, Dicastery, help us.
Thank you very much for this question. Be aware that we are in the middle of some kind of slope. So on the one hand, the need of these small gestures. So being daily acquainted, daily training of small gestures of love, of justice, of virtue. This is the idea of education, no? So family, parents, pairs as first initiators toward justice, certainly. And at the other end of the slope, sorry, but we have to use this concept, is the nightmarish concept of structure of sin. Mm-hmm. So it is a structure, it is complex, it's everywhere. So it requires a structure of grace, a structure of justice. So networking for this. We have one, otherwise we may lose hope. Some things can be extremely precise. In southern Italy, we have a sophisticated and well-trained structure of sin, which is called mafia. And sometimes there are buildings confiscated to mafia. Some of these buildings, some of these properties have been handed to Boy Scouts. So Boy Scouts headquarters recently have been burned by mafia guys. Why? Because when you start to offer something else to create a different justice, the evil reacts. But nevertheless, we have to continue.
That's powerful. Thank you, Tabaldo. Father Stan, a question please for you. What would it look like to implement Ubuntu in traditionally Western institutions that may not be inclined to have a human-centric approach to peace and justice due to their neoliberal agenda? They did not mention any of our universities here, but I think it's a relevant question even for us academics.
The first is conversion. I think humanity is flawed. That's why the good Lord came to earth. We must accept that our human systems, structures, and institutions, even our churches, are wounded. And that God can actually create out of this wounded creation, a new creation. And so it's really I don't agree with the presupposition of the question that the humanistic-centered values have been trumped in Western societies as a result of neoliberal capitalism or systems, political systems, and all the echo chambers we hear of the polarization between the right and the left. I think these are all signs of a civilization that has reached the end of its own natural humanistic or human-centered enunciation of values. Now we need, like Tina had pointed out, we need other forms of wisdom to help break this enlightenment, I call it the enlightenment hegemony, that has told us that everything is dual, these polarities. So I do not agree that the humanistic values cannot be implemented. I do see this every day in my work, not only in the academy, but in my work in humanitarian work. I see so many people here in the United States, in Canada, in Italy, in Germany. So the West is suffused with humanistic values. And I see them. It is for us to name them, constantly name them, tell the story of what God is doing in our communities, and then let these stories become for us a pilot to the kind of future that we are looking for. So Ubuntu is not an African value. Ubuntu is a human value that we are all connected, and we are all in this together. And unless we realize that, we will continue to fight each other and suffer, thinking that the enemy is the other person.
Thank you, Father Stan. And obviously that's also what Tina reminded us of from a Buddhist perspective, the natural idea of being in solidarity. I have one question left, which I will throw out to all panelists, and then you can just jump in. The question is, how can we effectively support African Americans to advocate for reparations for chattel slavery in the US? Every time it's even brought up, it seems like it's immediately rejected. So how can the church help with this? And particularly, how can white Catholics help with this? Any volunteers? This time I don't want to put anyone on the spot.
Well, I can chime in here.
That's what I thought. Please, please.
I already answered in the conversation. The first point, I think, is the United States of America needs something like a Truth and Reconciliation Commission. Mm-hmm. It has never been done. We have not come to terms with the devastating and ongoing negative legacies of chattel slavery. I teach a course on slavery here, and sometimes when I even tell the stories to Americans, those born here, white American students, they don't even know the history. Mm. Secondly, churches, and I think Georgetown has already begun that process, the Jesuits. Churches here must lead the way by acknowledging their own sinfulness, their own complicity in chattel slavery, and beginning the process of reparation. Because as someone who has lived here in the United States now for 7 years and worked here, I think racism is a big problem in our churches. I have experienced racism myself, from priests, from bishops, more than from everyday Catholics. So the churches must lead by example so that it can become a witness to a different way. And then organizations also. So I am becoming more aware that local processes work more effectively than anything national here in the United States that always ends up in Democrat and Republican polarities. So these are a few suggestions that I
Thank you. Thank you for that, Stan. What we will do now, with 5 minutes into our panel, I will invite each panelist for a 1 minute final statement. Maybe it's more prudent to say 30 seconds statement. And what would you like us to take away and go away with as we move into Holy Week? And I would start in the reverse order. I would ask Matthias first, then Tina, Tabaldo, Father Stan, and finally Sister Helen. Matthias. a final statement for the road as we try to live on.
Thank you very much, Clemens. This is so difficult. 30 seconds, no? Well, I think that we have to deepen our conception of justice, not to enrich it, to reach a deeper understanding that goes probably beyond what we have earned from the Enlightenment on justice. And I think this is quite important for the 21st century, you know, just to make a bridge with the previous intervention of Father Stan Illo, no? I think precisely, no, reparation regarding African Americans, it is about opening a future for all, not only for the white, but also for the black people in the United States. And this means that you have to think justice as something that opens a future. And this is something quite strange for the illustration. How does justice open a future? And this is quite an interesting question. So I will keep it that way. Thank you.
Thank you, Matthias, for another PhD dissertation topic. Professor Astorga.
Yeah, I think we have to see that justice is the first condition of love. And without restoration, there can be no love. I think that's important to see. And the other thing is really, I mean, neoliberalism, individualism, is what I call epistemological fallacy. It is not who we are. We are so deeply connected with each other so that we can really, and when we talk about deeply connectedness, we are not just deeply connectedness among ourselves, but we have also to recognize our deeply connectedness with non-human, with the earth, with the cosmos, right? Because we are, so that you can really look at a flower and say, I care for you because you're a part of me as you are a part, as I am a part of you as you are a part of me. I think we have to have a whole new vision of the world if we are going to heal the world.
Thank you, Tina. That's powerful. Yes, Dottore Tabaldo.
Grazie mille, carissimo. Let's remember that the description of sin and of healing follows 4 relations. So just relations with God, with myself, so human ecology, with the others, and with nature. And this ladder can be used according to the 2 levels, so bottom up or top down. So I can certainly be, let's say, a believer, and according to my faith, I will then work my relation with myself, with others, and with nature. But I can also start from nature, understanding the connection with the others, and then my role, and in the end, my relation with God. And maybe the baseline, so the relations with nature, is the easiest and widely shared concern with others. So with other groups, other communities, we can work together on this. And frankly, COVID-19 is a good occasion to restart the whole engine in the light of justice. It is a historic occasion.
Thank you, Tabaldo. That was deep and powerful. Reverend Stan.
Yeah, you know, the ancient philosophers taught us these transcendental attributes of beauty, unity, truth, and goodness. And I think the title of my present latest book is Something Beautiful to God. I think we need to recover beauty in one another. And that's what the parable of the Samaritan, what did the Good Samaritan see in the wounded man? We need to purify our eyes. The vision of global justice is to help us to see beauty and to recognize ugliness. And when we recognize ugliness, we can only work hard to bring out beauty. So I think we need to recover beauty from creation, see the beauty in one another, even see the beauty in the suffering that we face at this present moment.
Thank you so much for the stand. Most Reverend Sister Helen.
Thank you, Clemens, and thanks to all the others. I think I want to say 2 completely different things. The first one is we're right to focus on how we need relationality and new vision, and how difficult the society is that we're confronted with today, economic, politically. But let's not forget some of the good reasons why we have that society. I just want to say one thing. When Adam Smith wrote his famous phrase, "We don't expect our dinner from the benevolence of the butcher or the baker, but from their self-interest," what he was really concerned about wasn't that we should have the kind of self-interest that we see so much today, but that it's an equal relationship between people who are helping each other across a market. Whereas he was comparing the situation, which was the norm before, where if you wanted something, you had to go to someone higher up and beg for mercy and beg for help. And it was all about everyone having equality and being equal. And I think if we build more deeper relationships in society, we have to think about this question, that they try to deal with it, perhaps in the wrong way in the past, but let's not throw the baby out with the bathwater. There were some good things about that system. And my last thing I want to say is, I think the crucial thing in that document, that is the one that we're celebrating today, that brings together the church and the world, is the question of witness. That the church needs to be a true witness to justice. And if we can leave ourselves with that question, for me, that would be a wonderful way for us to end our session.
Thank you, Sister Helen, and thank you, my dear panelists, for being beautiful witnesses of justice. We are at time. Thank you to our audience. Thank you again, Sister Helen, Father Stan, Tabaldo, Tina, and Matthias. So much appreciated. We'd also like to thank those who have made this panel possible, especially Bill Purcell, Paula Muller, and our communication team, as well as Tim Kittos from ND Studios. Let me please announce that our next panel will be in 3.5 hours at 4 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time. It will be dedicated to hearing the gospel and spreading the good news.